In a healthy democracy, the rule of law is only as strong as its most hidden moments. We talk about justice in public, in courtrooms, and in policy debates, but the real test happens when the door is closed. In that room, the tension isn't just about solving a crime. It's about whether a system can stay objective under pressure. Can we move past confession-driven practices and treat interviewing as a forensic craft built for reliable facts? I'm Børge Hansen, and this is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. In this series, we will look at the mechanics of justice, from how interviews are conducted to how evidence holds up under scrutiny. Today is about the gap between what we know works and what actually happens under pressure. Practice, supervision, and the minimum safeguards that any justice system should demand. Today, I'm joined by Susanne Flølo and Chris Kelly, both active in the International Investigative Interviewing Resource Group, or iIIRG. They work to move evidence-based interviewing from research into day-to-day practice, where supervision, habits, and culture decide what sticks. Susanne, you work in human rights and investigative interviewing standards and has contributed to the UN Manual for Investigative Interviewing and the UNODC e-learning for investigative interviewing program. Chris, you're a professor at, and focusing on criminal justice, focus on what actually improves information quality in interviews. Susanne and Chris, thanks for joining us today. For listeners who have not come across iIIRG before, if you had to explain to a busy investigator in one sentence, what does iIIRG exist to change? And maybe just as important, what's iIIRG deliberately not trying to be?
I guess I could start with this in one sentence. iIIRG was created to fill that space that exists between academic research and real-world practice. And the explicit mission is to bring these two groups that have been historically, maybe not always at odds with one another, but sometimes not understanding one another. And when iIIRG was founded in 2007 or 2008, it was with the explicit intention of bridging the gap between research and practice.
Yeah. And
You in line with this, Susanne?
of course. No,
Yeah.
and first of all, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've listened to all the episodes of this podcast, so it's a great honor to have been invited to participate. I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. And like Chris is saying, for me, the mission and the purpose of iIIRG is very simple. We connect science to practice, and we try to make sure that people who conduct interviews, whether they are police, military, immigration, or oversight bodies, actually have access to what works. And we also, of course, try to help our members, whether they are practitioners, researchers, or other professionals, to uphold the highest professional possible standard in their work.
So what's your personal litmus test for an investigator that's operationally ready? One or two indicators.
Should I start on this one, Grace? Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people, I think, still treat interviewing as an art or an instinct, but to me, the litmus test of a good investigator isn't the confession, which Hollywood certainly could influence us to believe. Rather, it's whether you are able to create the conditions for accurate, complete, and reliable information to emerge. And interviewing is a disciplined forensic craft. It has methodology, structure, is based on science, and has profound consequences for justice, public trust, and even state stability. And in every country that we work in, at least, be it Ukraine, Thailand, Brazil, Indonesia, or others, we meet investigators who intuitively understand the value of rapport-based interviewing long before they even heard the term investigative interviewing. And many of them have discovered the hard way that confrontational, confession-driven methods simply don't get them the information that they need. So again, we're simply trying to bridge that gap between research and practice.
And I'll add to that, in terms of a litmus test, one of the most important things I've found is a level of curiosity about not just an investigation, but about the world, like a more openness to different possibilities and thinking beyond one's own, what we see right in front of us. And the best interviewers that I have encountered over the years have been the ones that can think outside of the box. And I really put a lot of value on that. And that's related to something Susanne just said about art and science. Practitioners, you hear that a lot. This is more art than science. And as a committed scientist, I have to object to that. I've come to believe that nobody wants to be thought of as a scientist, like maybe a white lab coat, or, I've got elbow patches on my jacket, and that's what a stereotypical scientist may be. And that's not very fun. Arts and artists are fun and creative and able to think outside of the box and think differently than anybody else. That's why we value paintings and music and writing and acting. These are people who break out of everyday norms. But I do believe that there's a science to that, and we can teach it.
So, I mean, Chris, to help with that, I think maybe frameworks like Peace, we have Creative, Orbit, they're well known. And if you strip it down for a working investigator under pressure, what's the smallest set of behaviors you think that protect reliability?
The essence is, in addition to keeping an open mind and being flexible, I think the couple of essential qualities that all of the models kind of boil down to, I think that was your phrase, Børge, which is stay nice, ask good questions, and listen. Actually hear what the people are saying and allow them to speak. Because the opposite of all those things, if you're confrontational, if you're asking closed questions, if you're interrupting people and doing more, if I'm the interviewer, if I'm speaking more than the interviewee, that's not actually an interview. And so I think with the open-mindedness comes a rapport building mentality that asks good questions and then lets the person speak. I think all of the models come down to that, basically.
Paired with the curiosity
Yeah.
and good analytic skills, I might add, but I absolutely agree with Chris.
So well, this is a good segue, and let's move to where everything, the reality starts and the pressure. And rules, frameworks are easy when things are quiet, and the pressure, and we've all seen it in cases both in Norway and UK, across the world. Officers are on the clock and they're expected to produce results. And when that pressure hits, that's when you find out what a system really values. And we, in the introduction, we talk about confession-driven practices. Why is it so that, still today, even when we know that investigative interviewing it's backed by science and it gives better results, why is confession-driven culture so strong within investigators across the world?
Do you mind if I start on this one? So, I mean, confession culture is, as you're saying, incredibly persistent. It is fast, or at least it's portrayed as fast. It's traditional. It's what supervisors often expect, and it's emotionally compelling. People feel like they've cracked the case when somebody admits guilt. The problem is that it's a terrible accuracy indicator. Confession-driven practices increase the risk of tunnel vision. They reinforce cognitive biases, and we know lead to errors of justice or even wrongful convictions. And they fundamentally also clash with the presumption of innocence and the real purpose of the interview, which is, of course, to gather information and not to extract agreement. And another reason, I think, why confession culture sticks around is systemic. Many police organizations point to lack of funding, time, or lack of leadership, focus, or priority. And all these explanations tend to be the same everywhere. But underneath them, I think it's something far more basic. It is that you cannot fix a problem that you haven't acknowledged exists. So no country is immune to errors of justice, but you don't see them unless you're willing to believe that they can actually happen in your system. And human fallibilities also play a huge role. Misunderstandings about suggestibility, confirmation bias, primacy effects, false memories. And I think acknowledging these fallibilities helps explain why interviews needs to be conducted in a structured, research-based way that actively mitigates these risks.
But Chris, is there, if we say that the science backs what Susanne is talking about now, how is it that still people find it, I don't know if it's culturally or if by practice or maybe they're taught differently. There's still some resistance to this, isn't it?
Yes, of course, because I think first thing is that not just the police, I'm not going to be throwing only the police under the bus, so to speak, on this. I mean, I can put university professors in the same camp of like, none of us like change. And going from a confession orientation to one of information gathering is a fairly large change in mindset and practice. And I will speak as an American. Unfortunately, we have higher rates of crime, in particular violent crime, than just about anywhere else in the developed world. And although our police are fairly well resourced, they're still not resourced enough to handle all the cases that come in. I mean, in 2025, in my city alone of Philadelphia, which is about 1.5 million people, we had 250 murders. And that's down from 500 just a couple of years ago during the pandemic. So we're still dealing, the police here, I'm not obviously part of the police, they're still dealing with that backlog of cases. And when and again, I'll speak specifically to an American context, the legal context, confession is king. When you get a confession, case is over. The detective can move on to the next case, pass off that confession to the prosecutor who knows that, barring some really distal issue in a courtroom, should it ever come to that, which is pretty rare, 97% of convictions in this country, and the number is similar around the world, come through guilty pleas. And when a defendant is thinking about the outcome of their case, and there's a confession there in the dossier or the file that the prosecutor has, that's a really powerful piece of evidence that's going to push somebody to plead guilty. And so not only are confessions good for the police, they're good for the prosecution as well, because it keeps things moving.
It's concrete results, if you will.
Exactly. It's very much outcome based, and it's short-term thinking, because it's here's a crime, I'm going to solve it. And I'm going to, if regardless of the veracity of the confession, it is just treated as truth, because there's still a widespread, this is changing, of course, widespread misunderstanding of why people say they did things that they actually didn't.
So in order to drive away from confession-driven practices, you need to focus on other types of results. Is that it then? Because
yeah, it's the incentives. The entire system is incentivized to get a confession, and because it works, and accusatorial style interrogations work. They are very effective at producing confessions. And as I like to say, it's so effective at producing confessions, they get innocent people to confess. And that obviously is where the problem is. And so the incentive structure needs to change away from a prosecutor needs to, even an investigator needs to scrutinize a confession more closely and verify everything that is in there. But until police leaders and prosecutors and maybe even lawmakers understand that a confession can be unreliable, and it's also, even for a guilty person with a true confession, there may still be more information to be had through an interview, but that confession just says, okay, I'm done. I've got to get on to my next case.
We'll get back to, how various parts of the world has changed and why they do it and how they change the systems. But Susanna, when, you're advocating both through iIIRG and the Norwegian Center for Human Rights and all the standardization, when standards are under strain, what's the first safeguard that you see that slips in real life? Because, even in countries where investigative interviewing is the standard, we slip. What's the first sign that, or what's the slippage to see? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big question, but empathy is a huge thing, and rapport. So we forget about empathy, and we forget about the importance of rapport building. So you get off to an extremely difficult start in high stakes situations. So I would say that the opening and the planning ahead of the opening is absolutely crucial. So everything that follows, it really rests on what happens there. So the opening determines rapport, it determines cooperation, and whether the interviewer manages to stay open-minded. And if you get that opening wrong, if you set a confrontational tone, you will probably never recover. And we also see the same linguistic red flags everywhere in the world. So that is leading questions or repeating a question until the person changes their answer or is so fed up with the interviewer that rapport just breaks down beyond repair. We have narrative summaries that omit or distort key details, and language that signals that the interviewer already has decided what happened. And these issues are indeed universal. And they matter because interviewing is not just about what the interviewer hears, it's also about what the interviewer elicits. And small language choices can fundamentally shape the quality and reliability of the information. So that is, again, why we insist on structure, planning, and a phased evidence-driven approach paired with the audio and video recording. Because as my colleague also likes to say, Dr. Ivar Fossing, when the stakes are high, you do not rise to the occasion, you sink to your level of training. And that is important to have in mind. So with high stakes, it's more pressure, and that's why it's so incredibly important to have a methodology in place. And that goes not only to the police, but to the entire justice system. I would say it's crucial.
So, Chris, where do you see the consequences of having a confession-driven or get answers fast type of culture?
I'm not sure in a confession culture there really are any. There are few safeguards down the line in terms of all the actors who are going to be reviewing this interview and the confession. Again, the incentives for prosecutors are to keep cases moving, get guilty pleas, and go on to the next file. But even judges and juries, in the rare instance that it comes to that, there is just a lack of understanding about good interviewing practices and reliable information or confessions that is produced as evidence. And my big concern, and I think we're probably going to talk about this at some point for obvious reasons, about recording and having that objective record, which is great. And that is the first recommendation you hear out of anybody's mouth when it comes to reform. Every academic article that has a practical implications section almost always references the importance of recording. But I always like to push back on that a little bit. It's not that I disagree that recordings should be made. They absolutely should. But it needs to come with an independent evaluation, because if you get a false confession and the video has multiple angles and the audio is crystal clear, like this podcast I'm sure is going to be, and you put that beautiful confession, which is false, in front of a group of jurors, you're going to be like, wow, that looked great. But without somebody contextualizing and analyzing what is said in that confession, all you have are the judges, juries, prosecutors, everybody's biases that are looking at a beautiful recording of a false confession. And I also like to state, not only am I an American, but I live in the state of Pennsylvania, where such confession experts are prohibited from testifying in court. There's this big push here in Pennsylvania to record all interviews, and it actually might be worse than having a detective read a confession statement into the record, because at least that way, defense attorney, for example, can cross-examine that detective and have some opportunity to poke holes in it. But when you have a crystal clear recording of it, it's hard to cross-examine a recording. So there needs to, those safeguards have to be carried through to the end to educate not just laypersons who may serve on a jury, but prosecutors and judges as well. Absolutely need to understand these things.
So under pressure, Susanna, you said that we don't rise to the occasion, but rather like sink to the level of our training. And if we move to the anatomy of an interview, the 2 first minutes probably can tell you a lot. And people call it first impressions. If you rush the opening, Susanna, what happens to the quality of the whole account?
I mean, if you rush the opening, you, of course, risk you're probably not very successful in building rapport. So you don't. I mean, you might still get a lot of information, but that's far less likely than if you build a good foundation from the outset. That's just.
So what does a strong opening actually do?
It lays the foundation for the entire interaction, really. Because if you, along the way, then are able to recognize that you're about to lose rapport again, you can go back and rebuild it. But if you start off on the wrong foot, it's highly unlikely that you will be able to recover. And as I mentioned, and I think I spoke a little bit about that previously, and it's extremely difficult to recover and come back in. So I think, in those cases when rapport breaks down from the offset of the interview, it's time to bring in a different interviewer and try again. But that also might be, it's not the ideal result. The best, get it right and do it once and do it well. That's pretty much it. And make sure that you have proper planning for that opening as well.
And I'd like to add to that, if I can, about, and it relates back to an earlier question, Børge, that you asked about the high pressure and what's the first thing to go. I think the first thing to go is patience. And it's related to planning and having an appropriate introduction to the interview, to taking the time to build rapport, which of course is not the same as becoming somebody's friend. It's about a working relationship that people on opposite sides of an issue need to understand one another's needs. And part of the loss of patience and wanting to rush into something is forgetting that other person's needs and only thinking about your own. And once that leaves, as Susanna says, like, it's really hard to recover from it. You can establish rapport and then it can waver a little bit and you can recover. But if it's not there in the first place, it's going to be really hard to get it back or get it in the first place.
So personally, I've attended Orbit training, and Orbit training has live actors with a full backstory, and the case lasts for several days. So it's a full immersive situation. And one of the things that was clear to me when I observed this is that even with training, and we could talk about building rapport, the actors there, they were playing either someone who was really traumatized and had strong withdrawal, and the other person who was probably traumatized as well, but very dominant and acting out in a very non-constructive way, to put it politely. I mean, how do we transfer science about, let's put it simply, building rapport and not leading questions into these kind of really difficult situations where you just try to cope and understand what's going on? I mean, most often these are police officers and not trained psychologists or behavioral therapists. I mean, that's really, really hard. How does the science, find its way into practice here? Chris, you want to go first?
The fact of the matter is that the science is still evolving. Or the examples that you gave about an interviewee who is experiencing some sort of traumatic, either an acute event while being interviewed, or just someone who suffers more generally from trauma. There's a little bit of research on this, but it's not nearly as mature as other things. And this is where understandably practitioners are frustrated that we don't have all the answers. And my retort to that is always, we don't have the answers yet. And what we're left with, and the only thing we really can do, is the practice that is based on the best research of the time. And so you mentioned Orbit in particular, and I know Orbit, I mean, I've been familiar with it from its origin. It has itself evolved over time, and it's going to continue to evolve because the team behind it is always working on understanding their own model better, and that they're updating it. And when the research is clear about how to question someone who's experiencing trauma, that model and others that hopefully are also very in sync with the science are also going to be evolving. And in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time, all of these models should look very different than they do right now. And so it's a sometimes very dissatisfying answer to somebody in the room who is trying to get answers. And the best we have is maintain rapport, stay calm, refer to your planning procedures, and ask good questions. And then ultimately sometimes, and this is a really dissatisfying answer to practitioners when I tell them, sometimes you're just not going to have a successful interview. And in a lot of ways, ending an interview unsuccessfully is preferable to falling back to unproductive, coercive, aggressive tactics, which is sometimes what happens when somebody gets frustrated. They're not getting what they want. even if they're trying to use the skills that they've learned in a science-based interviewing course and it's not working, they can revert to other practices in an attempt to get that information, when in fact it might be better just to at least temporarily pause, regroup, try again, have another interviewer who maybe has a little bit better experience with that kind of challenging interviewee. But again, that takes resources, that takes patience, that takes leadership. Every investigator has a series of supervisors who should be doing some oversight and making sure that the principles are being adhered to. But that breaks down pretty quickly oftentimes, which is unfortunate. But to reiterate my point, the science is evolving and it's always going to be evolving. And models like Orbit are continually bringing the new science into it and testing what they think they know, which is exactly what the scientific process should be.
So Susanna, you often you travel the world and you see people being trained. And then, as Chris says, are people getting impatient? Are they falling back to old tactics, or are they able to actually, as Chris alluded to have a bad interview instead of doing the wrong type of interview?
I think it depends, but what we're seeing is that often they're lacking a clear plan when they go into that interview room. And that goes for rapport building, for the opening, for the evidence, for everything. It's a stressful situation. And I mean, even in training settings, we see that people become incredibly stressed by this exercise, because you're sitting there and you're being viewed by your colleagues and your peers and even your superiors, and that adds a level of stress as well. So it's a matter of, we also need to make sure that we create a good feedback culture, and that we give them conditions for that, because otherwise, I mean, what we typically would hear is, oh, that went great when I was a supervisor doing the interview. Excellent, perfect, no notes. But it's never excellent or perfect or without notes an interview. We know that. So we also need to make sure that we build that feedback culture, and not only for the information, because that tends to be what people focus on. So what did you get from this? Not stopping and asking yourself, how did I do? What did I miss? Or how could I improve? Or people commenting, people sitting in the back room, looking at this, saying that, okay, so you're about to lose rapport here because, you're pushing too hard, or you need to take a step back, or you haven't properly explored. We need that type of feedback as well.
Yeah.
Just what information is lacking. And I mean, it might be extremely uncomfortable, and it is. I have to say, I highly, highly value the training initiatives and the Orbit model that Lawrence and Emily Allison um, and the work that they're doing. It's incredibly useful for us as well, because it's very difficult to teach rapport building. And of course, for practitioners, as Chris mentioned, it's frustrating, because at the end of the day, it's also, no matter how much you sort of read and train about interviewing, some people will never be good interviewers. And that is just the unfortunate reality. But we know that it requires that certain personal capabilities or traits for people are important in order to become what do all the good interviewers have. And typically, Becky Milne call it the X factor: who has it and who doesn't. But I think, fundamentally, you need curiosity, patience, and flexibility at the very least, and empathy. You need to be able to actually portray that empathy as well.
Can I give a
You-
quick anecdote, Børge? Sorry. And this is for anybody listening who is designing trainings and having role players. And I think back to a training I developed, or I was part of the team that developed, and then we were piloting it. I won't even mention the agency, definitely no names, but this was an experienced investigator who has been through science-based training. And we put into our training the role player where it wasn't trauma. It wasn't somebody who was belligerent. It wasn't somebody who was resistant. Our role player was overly cooperative. Now, it was all BS that this person was spewing, but they were like, yeah, come on in. I'm happy to talk with you. Anything you need, I'm happy to do it. We had probably had through 2 deliveries of this training over the course of a week, and we had probably 6 or 8 different teams rotating through that. Very few of them knew how to handle a cooperative, but somebody who's really not cooperative, but they're being nice about it. And so many of these experienced investigators just didn't know what to do, and they reverted to some unproductive practices, shall we say, because they were frustrated, they didn't know how to handle this, and they were expecting something else. And so it gave us an opportunity to talk about confirmation bias and having what your expectations are. Don't go in there expecting that just because you're the police, people are going to be resistant to you. You're going to get all kinds. And even in this role-playing exercise, it was a great demonstration. And I would encourage anybody designing role play to think about inserting that kind of suspect into it.
Not just putting up a fight, but being overly cooperative.
I believe that's what the Allison would refer to as a bad monkey, no? In the orbit model.
Yeah. This is a good segue because earlier, Susanne, you talked about feedback culture, and Chris, you bring up the different types of training and culture and how to handle it. Another blind spot is what leadership can actually see and manage. We talk a lot about the interviewer, but less about interviewers, what leaders can see and improve. And oftentimes, I'm suspecting that leaders are not part of the interview. They read a summary or a report. If a supervisor only reads a written summary, what do they miss? And what gets lost if you don't see the interaction?
I think what you're pointing at there, Børge, is one of the biggest global challenges. It's the accountability deficit and leadership. As you say, they rarely see the interview itself. So they tend to see the summary. And summaries, of course, they hide a lot: tone, pressure, leading language, body language, missed opportunities, and in some cases, even coercion. And they also tend to overstate certainty, giving the impression of a clean narrative where the actual interview may actually have been very messy. And I would add that the courts often also see or hear only the summary as well. So the entire justice system are making high stakes decisions without ever seeing what actually happened in the interview room. And this is why improving interviewing is never just about training frontline officers. So at NCHR, at least, we've seen repeatedly that unless you train also supervisors, managers, and leadership, and unless you build systems around them, the reforms, they just don't stick. So if leadership can only access a written narrative, they genuinely cannot know the true reality of what's happening in those rooms. So without institutional support for change, interviewing reform never make it past the pilot stage. You get a good training workshop, people are enthusiastic for a few months, and then the system pulls everybody back into old habits because the supervision, the metrics, and the accountability structures, they haven't changed a bit. And this brings me onto something that is often overlooked again. So the evaluation. I mean, how can you evaluate the quality of an interview or the quality of the information retrieved, even if you cannot revisit the interview in its most complete form? How do you learn from it? How do you train others? I mean, without recordings, all of these things become extremely difficult. And this is, I think, where leadership again becomes critical. So when senior leaders champion transparency, recording, and professionalization, everything changes. When they don't, nothing changes. I mean, you simply cannot build a culture of high quality interviewing without leadership creating the conditions for accountability, learning, and long-term reform.
So if you had to pick then, Susanne, what makes the science stick? Is it better training up front or day-to-day supervision?
Oh gosh, it's both. I don't think I can choose, but I think it's also it's also a fundamental understanding of the why. I mean, why are we doing this? Why do we need to do it this way? So I think that is also important to remind ourselves. And as I mentioned initially, I mean, if you think your system is perfect, you're not going to change it. I mean, you need to be critical of your own systems and your own structures, and actually go out and look for look for these errors, because you will not find them unless you believe that they actually exist.
Chris, if you work with leadership, what are there simple metrics that we could look at that?
Among the leaders that I've interacted with through the course of my work, they are ones who are more forward thinking, that recognize that change is inevitable, that there are always newer and possibly better ways of doing things. And in the realm of interviewing, we know there are better ways of doing things. The leaders who I have interacted with who embrace this movement are the ones who think of their organizations as learning organizations. They're not static. They're not just doing good enough. They're searching for something better. And in the realm of interviewing, we have those tools. But one leader does not make a social movement. And there are, for every forward-thinking leader who has the power to implement something like interviewing reform, there are probably several more who are resistant to it because they moved up in a system without that kind of reform and they succeeded in it. And why would they want to change something that they benefited from? And this ties back to the confession culture. And so one thing that I am always cognizant of is it needs to be both a bottom up and a top down issue. I mean, the people doing the interviewing are not going to reform themselves. And so there has to be some top down. And I mean, in police organizations, they follow that command and control structure. People who go into that line of work are typically ones who follow rules pretty well and will do what they're told as long as it makes sense to them. And so there has to be some top down, we're going to do it this way. But it's got to be reinforced because leaders rotate. They promote up, they retire, they move on to different opportunities, and then somebody new comes in and you might have to start all over, which is unfortunate. And I think we've seen in the peace model, and maybe in Norway, I'm not familiar with it enough about the history of it, that it's going to take, any sort of change like this is going to take a generation. And this is where the bottom up process comes from. We have to reach people who are younger or at least newer in their careers, get them to see the value of science-based investigative interviewing. And then as they promote up, they become the ones that supervise the interviews and give that feedback, that constructive feedback that we all know is so important. But it's going to take time and a concerted effort from the beginning. And I will always give credit to former Detective Mark Severino, the Los Angeles Police Department, who had some success in his agency before he retired of getting some investigative interviewing training to brand new recruits. So not waiting until somebody promotes up into an investigations rank, but someone who's going into patrol, because they're doing interviews and talking to people all the time. And when you expose people brand new into the policing profession, they are able to carry that with them throughout their careers and not pick up those bad habits, hopefully. And then that takes the generation. That's what takes 20 years.
But when you see poor practices show up, what does a good response in a healthy organization look like?
I think if I've learned nothing else, and let me shout out a dear friend and colleague named Mike McClary. Mike was the assistant sheriff in charge of investigations in the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And that's a very, very high ranking person. I mean, at the time, I think he was that assistant sheriff. The only position higher than him was an elected sheriff. And so, And I've learned a lot from Mike over the years working with him, but I think the lesson I've learned most and internalized most is that you can't tell police or academics for that matter what they did wrong without telling them this is how you do better. That a criticism, or whether it's a one-on-one kind of debrief about a specific interview or in a 5-day interview course, going in to tell a police officer who takes pride in their work, thinks they're good at what they do, that what you've been doing is bad or wrong, is just going to make them shut down. It's about saying, we can do better. And here are the ways to do it, either specifically in any sort of review of an individual case or in a training setting, that we have ways of improving upon the practice. And it is far less about what not to do, because what you did can't change the past. It's about improving in the future. And so try this next time, and think about how an interviewee might respond when you get a little bit frustrated or impatient, and the effect that has on rapport and the amount of information, the quality of the information you're going to receive going forward to the next case.
A bit earlier in the conversation, we talked about the recording of an interview, and let's talk a little bit about that. Not as technology, but more on the trust part. What makes it credible, and what can quietly undermine the recording? Susanna, you've been around the world pushing legislation. What do you see?
So what we often see is that people tend to think of the recording as sort of a technical add-on or a luxury, but in our view, it's not. I mean, it's my view, it's the engine that drives professionalism. And interestingly as well, it can actually accelerate reform. And in Norway, we saw this clearly. So when video recording became mandatory, many police officers were initially hesitant because they didn't feel fully confident in their skills. But that the transparency actually pushed the whole system to invest in training, in structure, and in preparation. So recording didn't follow the reform. It was instrumental to the reform. And it was sort of the catalyst that moved interviewing from a private, unobservable practice to a shared professional discipline that everybody could learn from. And I guess that's the beauty of it as well. Recording interviews, it improves accountability almost immediately. It strengthens evidence, promotes fairness, protects the interviewee, the information, and the interviewer. Even a bad interview, the full recording is protection. And it also creates a feedback loop for training. I mean, you can revisit your own interviews, or you can see how colleagues approach difficult moments. And when you can do that, the quality of practice rises quickly. So it becomes a craft, not merely improvisation. So if a justice system say that it has limited resources, we typically point them in the direction of recording as an obvious starting point.
But as you said, in Norway, when back in the day, people were hesitant because you become self-aware, you don't like to be scrutinized and all that. Now, in 20, 30 years later, when you guys travel the world and help train, is that still a constraint? I mean, people do use their mobile phones for everything and anything these days, recording themselves often.
Yeah, but unfortunately not recording interviews. I wish that was the case, but it's not. But I mean, it happens, but it's not at the scale as we would like it to. And again, it's preservation of the evidential record. We if it's only like a snippet of an interview, we don't really know, do we? I mean, and also if it's just recorded on the mobile phone, how do you protect that evidential record? It's very difficult. So you need proper systems in place, because there's no guarantee in many cases that they didn't just put the recording on just as the suspect decided that they're willing to finally confess to whatever he's accused of.
Everything Susanna said is right about it's part of the reform. It can feed into training. But I also like to make a pitch that it's good for research too. The unit I've worked most closely with in Las Vegas is actually based within what's called the Clark County Detention Center. It's their jail. And it's a huge facility. And within that, there's a gang investigations unit. And I've worked with this small unit for about 10 years now. And they had been recording their interviews long before they heard of me or probably even science-based interviewing. But we started working with them because they were a unique unit in terms of their investigations. It wasn't criminal, it was intelligence gathering within the jail. And we were the first thing we did with them was they record and they stored all their interviews, and they said, here, they gave, I can't remember how many they gave us, but we took a random sample out of that of 50, and I analyzed them with my team and was able to give them feedback based on what we learned from what we watched. And so having outside experts, if I may, analyzing what these professionals are doing, we were able to feed back into their practice. And that process endeared us to these professional investigators, because they realized that we were not there to harm them. We were there to try to help them. And I was best able to help them because I saw what they were doing. And in your introduction, Borga, of me, as I work with police to improve practices. Well, sometimes you've got to start with a baseline of what they're actually doing and then build up to improvement. And one example from this study that I did with this unit was they kept interrupting their interviewees. The interviewees they'd ask a question, interviewee would start talking, and then the investigator would just talk over them. And if I think they took one message away from my feedback to them, it was just like, let them talk. And then I continued to work with this unit over the years, including bringing science-based training to them. And we did a pre-post evaluation, and we could even look to that initial study, to the training study, and then the post-training. Like their practices just improved over time, the more that they were exposed to this. And so recording provides data for somebody like me to help as an outsider. And I mean, we got to go back to that thing that I was saying earlier about, I'm not here to tell you all the bad things you did. I'm going to help you try to think about some strategies for improvement going forward. And that brings in issues of, I'm an outsider to an agency. Police are inherently suspicious of people like me, thinking I'm going to harm them in some way. And that's a different conversation altogether, how to overcome that. But recording provides a corpus of data to help.
But earlier you also mentioned that sometimes it could be a false positive, that a brilliant recording, camouflage is actually a bad interview or even a forced confession.
And that's a great point to leap into this idea of ground truth. And the type of research I do, where I partner with an agency, they give me their recordings or at worst transcripts of their interviews, and barring some additional information, I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't know if the police are telling the truth, but I also don't know if the suspects are telling the truth, or the interviewees. And so we just have to work with what they give us and acknowledge that limitation, which is a limitation, maybe the biggest limitation in the type of research I do. But then it also gets contextualized and triangulated with other research methodologies, existing surveys and interviews or research interviews, focus groups, experimental laboratory studies, that when we take the totality of a finding from all these different methodologies, we can have some faith or some confidence in reliability.
So it's 2026 now, and so we have to talk about AI. Earlier in this podcast series, we had representatives from the Norwegian police, the Oslo Police District, and the West Police District working with a project called AI for Interviews. What's iIIRG's thoughts about AI assistance during interviews?
I'm not sure if we've taken a stance on this as an organization for iIIRG, but I would say we are setting out, that's one of our priorities, which is to promote responsible use of technology. And I can only speak from my side personally, and that is that I'm hearing a lot of stories about police officers already using the tools that are out there. So I think we're running a huge risk if we do not get involved. If we do not get the police involved with the AI train, I think we're running the risk that people are going to use it anyway, and we're going to have a lot of information that's not meant for the public out there in these open language models.
So what you're saying that you see in practice that people are actually using AI tools, but they're not necessarily approved for the use, rather like a shadow used to help them do their work.
Well, I'm not seeing it, but I'm hearing it.
Yeah.
If we know that police, lawyers and prosecutors, they're also people. So if they are statistically like other people, which I think they are, of course they're using AI tools in certain ways. But I think it's important that the police also get on board with this development, because you are running the risk that if people are using these tools anyway, then you might end up distributing sensitive information. And that is a huge risk. And we, of course, know that the criminals are definitely using AI tools, to improve their scamming. Ignoring it is not the solution. But I don't have I surely Chris can say something about this as well.
As an organization, iIIRG is interested in the responsible use of technology. And AI obviously is the latest thing, and it has potential to be very powerful, but we don't really know. And we don't know the effects of it. And I may be repeating myself here, but as a researcher, I feel like I need to advocate for more research on this. But as an individual skeptic, the history of policing has been a history of finding shortcuts to the conclusion that they want to get to. And I think we need to be very careful about the use of not just AI, but any technology, but since AI is it, about how that can be seen as a shortcut that actually undermines good practice. The fact is, we don't know. We need more research. I mean, I know there are people out there studying AI in the interview room right now, but the polygraph machine comes to mind. That's a shortcut, and it's been used as a shortcut. And back to the beginning of our conversation, the incentive structure is you've got to get through these cases. You got to get on to the next one. And AI is seen as and if AI is seen as simply a new shortcut, I don't think it's going to be very effective at all. And I am hesitant to go all in on the benefits of AI when we don't really know what the benefits are. And there's just as real possibility that there are downsides to it, because large language models learn the incentives that humans learn. And an LLM knows that a confession is going to lead to a conviction. That the AI model is going to push into that direction as well. And that is very dangerous territory, which I personally, maybe it's because I've crossed some threshold of age and in life, I'm just, new technology, I'm not so sure about this. But we need to be cautious that this may just be another shortcut that circumvents good practice.
It
What
just
I'm
comes
hearing
to
is,
mind
go on.
what happened when, by the time they released the 2.0 version of the OpenAI LLM, which actually became dumber than the first one because people started using it.
But what I hear is the goal isn't more tech as such. It's a record that the court can trust and a process that people can rely on, right? That's the goal there. But if we want this to stick globally, what actually drives change? And we talked about these reforms for years. And are we seeing a shift, or are we fading out? And what drives lasting change the most?
I mean, I definitely think that we are seeing a global shift. So it's not just isolated successes, but there's broad momentum for investigative interviewing. And I mean, for us in IIRG, we've seen a significant increase in our work and also in my work at NCHR and the Norwegian Mendes Center. The interest in investigative interviewing generally is increasing, it seems, everywhere. So Europe, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and more governments, training centers, and oversight bodies are certainly reaching out to us because they want to move away from confession-driven models towards something genuinely professional, ethical, and effective. And I think at the international level, we've also had some very significant developments in recent years that I want to mention. With the Mendes principles, we got for the first time a clear human rights framework for interviewing and information gathering. And the Mendes principles, I believe, are now available in 23 languages. And we've also developed and adopted the UN Manual on Investigative Interviewing that anchors that science into practical guidance for states and individual officers. And that is available in English, French, Arabic, Ukrainian, and very soon Spanish and Thai, all translated by the local groups working on the implementation of investigative interviewing in these countries. And finally, the UNODC e-learning course on investigative interviewing, which is allowing us to scale training rapidly and at a very low cost, reaching practitioners who would never have access to this material otherwise, and often in their local language. So I think together, these science-based tools and all the decades of research that comes into those, they create a common language for policymakers and practitioners. So they've, in a sense, professionalized the conversation. States can now say, yes, we want this because the implementation is understandable, operationalized, and it's also supported by global standards. So all in all, I would say that definitely investigative interviewing has moved from a niche reform to a global professional standard. I think this is also evident again in the membership for IIRG and also the implement this EU cost action. So the latter, which is of course the EU initiative, now has members from every corner of the world. And I would say also, perhaps more encouragingly, we're seeing that the global south is taking lead in many efforts. Brazil, Thailand, Indonesia, to name a few, but there's many other countries that are innovating, textualizing, and driving implementation forward. And I also want to really highlight the incredible work being done by our colleagues in Ukraine on implementing investigative interviewing, which started before and now is happening at full scale, even during the full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation. So I think investigative interviewing is indeed already an universal professional standard that gives institutions more stability, better evidence, and increases public trust. And that is no matter what region or system that you're operating in.
We talk about, I don't know if we can talk about Ukraine for a second. I mean, it's clearly a high pressure situation in the whole country. Do you guys know what was the trigger for them to go down the investigative interviewing route and short what change in practice and stop it from sliding back? Because it's interesting, because I've read somewhere, I don't know how it is now, but it used to be one of the most corrupt states in the world. And this is about, seeking out the facts and the truth and not just getting things confirmed that you already know.
First, I just want to say that I absolutely agree with Chris that we cannot take these developments for granted. I mean, this is something that we need to continue to work with for Ukraine. I mean, they've made some really important strides. I mean, they have this incredible baseline study that you can also go in and read. It's available online in English even, but it's many things, and we had it's many reasons why they're moving on with this, and it's of course one of the big motivations, I would say, since the full-scale invasion, is a will to distance themselves also from the opposing side in that war. So that's part of it, but it's also, I think, a genuine will to improve information and know that what's happening now with the war creates, well, they're overloaded with information, and they're sitting on thousands of cases, each individual investigator. And these are cases that will matter for generations to come after this war is over. So indeed, extremely high stakes, and they want to make sure that they do the victims and the families justice in these cases. Yeah, I think it's a combination of many reasons, and I think that probably warrants also its very own podcast episode at some point.
Absolutely.
So I can have that for my have our Ukrainian colleagues explain that themselves. But yeah, it's really encouraging to see because they don't just have one leg to stand on, and they actually managed to build this training infrastructure around the development. So they've been able to create consistency in their training delivery, and that is something that I know it's quite difficult to reach. And in particular, I would say, like for an institution like the police, because people tend to move around, and especially in particular in leadership positions and mid-level management.
So I know that not everywhere it's the change is driven by legislation. Somewhere it's driven, a few places actually driven by individuals with a bit of a belief. So if there's like a chief of police listening here, what's the one move they can make Monday morning, no budget, that nudges practices in the right direction?
I think they should go to iirg.org, iiirg.org, sign up for our newsletter, become a member, maybe look into attending one of our IIRG in Conversation webinars and our in-person conferences, the next of which is happening in July 2026. But in all seriousness, besides that pitch, I think starting to get plugged in with the world community, and it is a world community now, and IIRG is just one piece of this. And because Susanna and I are here representing IIRG, I'll make that plug. But we are not the only organization that has low cost, low barrier to quality information. The information is out there, and the paywalls for scientific journals, I mean, there are ways around them, but there are organizations like IIRG, like Implemendes, that have information that's freely available. And of course, the Interviewing Principles website for the Mendez Principles. And it's out there. They just have to, they have to reach out. And then once I think they get plugged in, and through IIRG, we see this all the time. Oh, we just found your organization, signed up for your newsletter, went to a webinar, and that just kind of sparks some interest. And we can't do everything, but we can do a whole lot as a small organization that gives people the entree into this world of investigative interviewing.
But if they do that, what's the first thing they should see improve in weeks or months, not years?
I think a mindset change is, and that's necessary. It is, what we would say classically, it is a necessary but not sufficient condition to change. But there has to be a basic level of education, and that if we have a police chief, your fictive police chief that you referred to earlier, who has a sense that there's a better way of doing things, they find us at IIRG or any other science-based organization that promotes this work, they start to learn that there is a different way to do it, a newer way to do it, a better way to do it. And that once you have realized that there is a worldwide network out there of people who are willing to help, that appreciation for the science and improved practice is absolutely the first step. And then that leader has to implement it in their agencies. And then there are resources for that. That's what Implemendes is all about, helping people make change within the organization in which people find themselves. And so the educational piece, where an awareness of this practice is the first step. And that's where everybody has to start. And then I think the ball starts rolling very quickly after that.
I absolutely agree with Chris. And I also think that what we can help with is also to connect them, because I'm sure in whichever country this imaginary commissioner is sitting now, but again, that we have contacts in that country that are working on the topic of investigative interviewing. So we would be more than happy to connect him or her with the research the research community in the country, because that's the research that we're seeing that is not fully utilized. So, but we will be more than happy to connect with anybody who has an interest in starting up with investigative interviewing, either just of curiosity or if they're more ambitious and want to change their entire want to come up with a new police reform on the matter. So we're open to everybody.
It's good. So the playbook isn't mysterious. It's pick driver, hardwire into supervision, and make quality visible. And iIIRG is here to help.
Exactly.
Yes, indeed.
Effective interviewing is not just a people skill. It's a forensic discipline that protects the heart of the justice system. If we don't get the room right, the record can't rescue it. Susanna, Chris, thanks for joining Beyond a Reasonable Doubt and for helping move reliable practice to scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Børge.
Thank you so much for having us.